Welcome back to Sleepy Chronicles. Tonight, we're asking why medieval teenagers were totally wild, or whether they were simply the first generation asked to become adults overnight, with no space in between. We begin in a farmhouse yard, watching a boy set down a wooden practice sword he no longer has permission to want. Lie back and get comfortable. If you enjoy quiet voices and slow history, take a moment to like and subscribe. It costs nothing and means a lot. Let us know where you're listening from tonight. We'll take it from here. In most farmhouses, growing up did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way weather does all at once, without asking permission. Edwin was 14, the week his father handed him a plow line instead of letting him watch from the fence. No one sat him down first. His father simply placed the leather strap in his hands, nodded at the ox, and walked off to check the fences, as if the matter were already settled. It was not settled, not for Edwin. His hands didn't yet know how to hold the line so the ox wouldn't wander, and the field looked twice as long as it had from the fence. Behind him, propped against the woodpile where he'd left it that morning without deciding to, sat the wooden practice sword he and his friends used for mock battles after chores. He didn't go back for it that evening. What is easy to miss here is not the labor itself. It is how little discussion surrounded the shift. 1 week, he was a spectator. The next, he was accountable for a straight furrow. And everyone simply assumed the change had already happened inside him. By the second afternoon, his shoulders ached in a way they never had, and blisters had opened on both palms. He said nothing about either, complaining. He'd already worked out, belonged to a version of himself nobody seemed to be addressing anymore. Imagine holding a strap that suddenly makes you responsible for something living. In a field you've walked past your whole life, and realizing no one is coming to check whether you're managing. His neighbors noticed differently than his parents did. They stopped asking after his health and started commenting on the straightness of his furrows, as though his worth could now be measured in soil. For a girl in a market town, growing up arrived through an address, not through labor. Alice was 13 when her mother packed a small bundle of clothes and walked her 2 streets over to a weaver's house she had visited perhaps 5 times in her life. Her fingers were already rough from years at her mother's spinning wheel. But rough hands, it turned out, were not the same as being ready. What rarely gets mentioned is that nobody treated this as a milestone. There was no farewell. Alice's mother simply knocked, exchanged a few words with the weaver's wife, and left. The weaver's wife looked her over the way a merchant inspects a delivery, then handed her a shuttle and told her where she'd sleep. A modern teenager leaving for university still gets driven there by a parent, still calls home most nights, still gets to be homesick out loud. Alice unpacked her bundle into a stranger's rhythm and was simply told this was what growing up looked like. Picture folding your own clothes into someone else's shelf, learning someone else's schedule, and being told there was nothing unusual about any of it. She cried once, on the second night, quietly enough that no one heard her. By the following week, she had stopped counting the days since she'd left, mostly because counting made it worse. What's easy to forget from this distance is that Alice never chose the weaver's house at all. Someone else decided she was ready, and her only task was to catch up to that decision as quickly as she could. Boys were not the only ones discovering that year that the world had quietly reassigned them. Between the farmhouse and the weaver's cottage, an entire generation lived the same unspoken arithmetic. One day, a clumsy mistake was forgiven because the one who made it was still a child. The next, it earned a lecture on responsibility, not out of cruelty, but because fields didn't wait for a boy to learn the plow line, and households didn't wait for a girl to feel steady before she was needed. Perhaps that is the quiet arithmetic of medieval youth. The world did not wait for either of them to feel ready. It only asked that they act as though they already were, and kept asking until eventually they simply were. Fashion in a medieval town was never just about clothes. For certain apprentices, it was closer to a public announcement. Wilkin was 16 and had just spent 3 months saved wages on a pair of shoes, with toes so long they reached past the end of his actual foot by a full hand's width. He stepped out of the cobbler's stall grinning, the new leather stiff and creaking, a length of cord already tied from each toe up around his shin, so he wouldn't trip over his own ambition. His master saw him before he'd crossed the square, and simply closed his eyes for a moment, as though praying for patience he already suspected wouldn't arrive. What is almost funny here is that the shoes never once made the work easier. That was never the point. A cobbler's apprentice wearing shoes no cobbler would recommend was, in its own quiet way, the whole message. Imagine trying to walk briskly through a crowded market with 2 feet of pointed leather roped to your shins, while half the street pretends not to watch for the moment you finally trip. The town council, it turned out, had opinions about this. Laws appeared limiting exactly how long a young man's shoe points were allowed to be, tied directly to how much his father earned each year. A cobbler's apprentice in shoes meant for a merchant's table was, to the men who wrote such laws, something closer to a crack in the floor of the whole social order. What the council never quite said aloud was the real complaint underneath the law. A dyer's apprentice in the wrong shoes could no longer be told apart from an alderman's son at a glance. And for a town that ran on knowing exactly where everyone belonged, that was a far bigger problem than tripping. A modern teenager might camp outside a shop overnight for a pair of limited sneakers, missing a full night's sleep for something that will pinch by afternoon. Wilkin tied cord around his ankles for the same reason, 3 centuries early, with considerably less footwear technology and considerably more rope. By evening, the cord had rubbed a raw line into his skin, and he still refused to admit it hurt. The shoes never made him faster. They only made him louder. Not every declaration that year involved leather and cord. For a miller's daughter, heartbreak didn't need a reason. It only needed an afternoon. Marjorie was the miller's daughter, 15, with flour permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles, no matter how often she scrubbed them. At the summer fair, a boy from the tanner's row said exactly 9 words to her near the cider barrels, and then walked off to watch the wrestling. What nobody warned her about is how loudly 9 words can echo when nothing else is competing for space in a person's head. She replayed them on the walk home, replayed them while grinding grain the next morning, and was still replaying them 3 days later when her mother asked, not for the first time, where the flour order had gone. Picture turning over a single sentence. Someone said to you so many times that you can no longer remember whether they actually smiled when they said it, or whether you've simply decided they must have. The fiddle music that evening had made everything feel larger than it probably was. The kind of night where an ordinary sentence could be mistaken for a declaration. Marjorie's mother, watching her daughter stir the same pot for the 4th time, without noticing it had gone cold, only sighed. She recognized the symptoms. She had once had them herself, for a boy whose name she now genuinely couldn't recall. What made it worse, or better, depending on the week, is that nothing about medieval village life offered any distraction from a feeling like that. A modern teenager can at least block a number, avoid a hallway, wait for a new school year to reset everything. Marjorie had none of that. Tomorrow she would see him again at the well, and the day after that, and would have to decide all over again whether 9 words meant anything at all, whether it was 2 feet of pointed leather or 9 words by the cider barrels. Wilkin and Marjorie would each spend that whole year insisting they didn't care what anyone thought of them. Neither one, notably, ever stopped checking. A church bell rung at the wrong hour could empty an entire town square in under a minute, which was, naturally, exactly why it was worth ringing. Osborne was 15, a baker's apprentice with soot permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles from years of raking ovens. On a warm evening, once the last loaf had gone out and his master had finally gone to bed, he and 4 friends climbed the church tower and rang the bell meant only for fires, funerals, and disasters. Imagine standing at the base of a rope thick enough to summon half a town, knowing the moment you pull it, every door on the street is about to open at once. Within minutes, half the street had spilled out of their houses in various states of undress, expecting smoke or worse. What greeted them instead was the sight of Osborne and his 4 friends still clinging to the bell rope, red-faced and utterly unable to keep a straight face. What is easy to overlook here is that the joke only worked because the bell meant something serious. Ring a bell nobody trusted, and nobody would have come running at all. The prank borrowed its entire punchline from an emergency system nobody had asked to lend it. The priest was the only one who didn't find it remotely funny, a detail Osborne would remember for years. The men who'd abandoned their supper searching for smoke that didn't exist felt much the same. A modern teenager filming a prank knows, within the hour, whether it landed. A phone screen fills with reactions before the joke has even finished happening. Osborne had to wait until morning, standing outside the bakery, to learn from 3 separate neighbors exactly how his evening was being discussed. He was fined his master added extra chores for a month, muttering something about ovens and idle hands. Osborne considered the whole exchange, privately, an excellent trade. What the priest never seemed to grasp is that the fine changed nothing at all. By autumn, half the apprentices on his street had rung the bell at least once. None of them, notably, ever got tired of the run afterward. Bells were not the only things medieval teenagers were willing to risk trouble over. Reputation on a medieval street was worth defending with fists, even when nobody could quite remember what had actually started the argument. Hal was 16, a mason's apprentice with hands already calloused from stone dust, when a boy from the next street called one of Hal's friends a fool outside the tavern. Nobody present could later agree on what the fool comment was actually about. It hardly mattered. Picture the exact half-second before a fight actually starts. The shove already thrown, the crowd already stepping back, and no clear way anymore to simply walk off instead. What nobody says out loud in the moment is that the fight was never really about the insult. By the time Hal's fist connected with the other boy's jaw, both of them were defending something closer to their entire street's honor than any specific sentence. Carrying a blade after dark was, on paper, illegal in Hal's town, a rule the magistrates reissued so regularly that its own repetition had become a kind of local joke. In practice, Hal kept a short knife tucked against his belt most evenings, less from any plan to use it than from simple habit. That night, he never touched it. Fists, it turned out, were enough. A modern disagreement can be settled, or at least postponed, behind a screen. A sharp reply typed and deleted twice before finally being sent, or never sent at all. Hal had no such delay available to him. An insult outside a tavern demanded an answer before the next round of ale arrived. By morning, Hal had a split lip and a story he told 3 different ways, depending on who was listening. What none of the 3 versions mentioned was how frightened he'd actually been for exactly 1 second before his fist had already decided the matter without him. His mother examined his face over breakfast, sighed the particular sigh reserved for sons who had clearly not learned anything, and asked only one question. Did you win? He said yes. His friends, when asked separately, or somewhat less certain. So the question worth sitting with is this: if neither boy could explain the next morning exactly why any of it had felt so necessary, was it really about the bell or the fist, or was it simply that being 15 or 16 has never needed a very good reason at all by the time a teenager reached 15 or 16? Everyone around him seemed to have already decided who he was going to become. Nobody had thought to ask him. Godwin was the exception who tried to argue back. He was 16, a blacksmith's apprentice bound to a 5-year contract, with forearms already thick from hammering, and a permanent burn scar along one wrist from a mistake in his 2nd year. His master was not cruel exactly, only relentless 18-hour days, no wages until the contract's end, and a temper that emptied itself onto whichever apprentice stood closest. Godwin had absorbed more of that temper than anyone, mostly for the crime of being the tallest, and therefore the easiest to reach. One night in early autumn, Godwin simply walked out the gate and kept walking. What almost never gets mentioned is how little of an actual plan this required, and how much of one it turned out to need. Beyond the direction he'd chosen, away, he had nothing settled. No coin saved, no town in mind that might take him in, no answer ready for anyone who asked why a blacksmith's apprentice was walking alone at night. A contract didn't simply end because he'd stopped honoring it. Any constable who recognized him for what he was could hand him back to his master with little more than a signature. Imagine standing at a crossroads at midnight, every direction equally unfamiliar, knowing the one thing you're fully certain of is what you're walking away from. A modern worker unhappy with a bad boss can hand in notice on a Friday and start somewhere new on Monday. Godwin's contract had 5 years left on it, and no clause for simply changing his mind. Walking was, quite literally, the only resignation letter available to him. By the 3rd day, his feet had blistered through both boots, and hunger had become a more immediate problem than freedom. What nobody warns a runaway apprentice about is that distance doesn't erase a contract. It just adds hunger to the list of things waiting for him at the end of it. He was gone 11 days before hunger, not guilt, turned him back toward his master's forge. He kept walking anyway, the whole way home, refusing to admit defeat with his feet, even as his stomach had already surrendered. Not every weight that year came with blistered feet attached. For a merchant's daughter, adulthood could be decided in a single conversation she wasn't even invited to. Cecily lived on the other side of town, 14. A merchant's daughter with ink permanently smudged along 2 fingers from helping her father with the account books. She learned about her own betrothal the way she learned most things that mattered, through a wall. Her father and a wool merchant from 2 streets over had been drinking and talking business for an hour before she caught her own name mentioned alongside a dowry figure, a delivery schedule, and a wedding date already tentatively set for spring. What is easy to forget from this distance is that nobody considered this cruel. Marriage was a contract between families first, and a feeling between 2 people a distant second, if it was consulted at all. Picture standing outside a door, listening to your entire future get negotiated in the same tone used for a shipment of wool, and only learning your own wedding date secondhand through the wall. A modern teenager can swipe past 100 profiles deciding entirely on her own terms who might be worth a second conversation. Cecily's opinion of the wool merchant's son, a boy she had spoken to exactly twice, was not part of the negotiation at all. She wore the betrothal ring for 3 days before it fit properly, twisting it absently at the account table, while she added figures that, this time, included her own dowry among the columns. What nobody in her family seemed to notice is that she kept adding those columns twice, as though checking the arithmetic might somehow change the total. Godwin's contract and Cecily's ring had this in common. Both had been decided by someone else entirely, and both were expected, eventually, to feel like a choice. By spring, Godwin was back at the forge, 18 months from freedom, pretending the escape had never happened. By spring, Cecily was married, standing beside a boy she was still carefully getting to know. Asked that spring whether the past year's decision had truly been their own, both would probably have said yes, and both, quietly, would have been lying. Nobody in this story ever really finished growing up. They simply reached the age where they were expected to do the deciding for someone else. Edwin was 31 the evening his son turned 6, 8 years, if the pattern held, before the world would hand the boy something far heavier than a wooden sword. he found himself in the yard that night, whittling the toy by firelight, shaped almost exactly like the one he himself had left propped against a woodpile at 14, and never gone back for, without consciously deciding to copy it. What is strange, watching from the outside, is how naturally he slipped into the very role he'd once resented, without ever noticing the switch. He handed his son the sword the way his own father had once handed him a strap and an ox to manage, except this time with a smile attached, and the boy ran off delighted, unaware that behind that smile was a small debt quietly being repaid. Imagine holding a piece of wood you carved with your own hands, watching a child swing it with complete joy, while some older, tireder part of you remembers exactly how quickly that joy runs out. A modern father might hand his son a video game and step back, attention already elsewhere. Edwin crouched to eye level and told his son, gently, that the sword was only for play. For now, the way no one had ever quite explained the rules to him. What Edwin never said aloud, that evening or any evening after, is that he still didn't know whether the world had done something cruel to him, or simply something necessary that happened to feel cruel at the time. He suspected it was probably both. The ploughboy became the man who decided, one firelit evening, how long his own son's childhood was allowed to last. For the ones who'd once stood shaking in a stranger's doorway. Growing up meant eventually becoming the stranger in it. Alice was 30 that same year, running her own small weaving house with a 13-year-old girl, newly arrived, clutching a bundle identical to the one Alice herself had once carried. The girl's hands were already rough from a spinning wheel at home, her eyes carrying that same careful blankness Alice remembered wearing herself, the practiced look of someone trying hard not to seem afraid. What is easy to miss is how tempting it must have been to soften that doorway for someone else, the way nobody had ever softened it for her. And how often, in other households, that temptation quietly lost. Alice looked the girl over exactly once, the way she'd once been looked over herself, then caught herself, and did something her own mistress never had. She knelt down to the girl's height and said her name aloud twice before handing her the shuttle. A modern employer onboarding a nervous new hire might offer a tour, a handbook, a mentor for the first week. Alice had none of that available, only a shuttle, a name spoken kindly, and whatever small mercy she could invent on the spot. It wasn't much. It cost her nothing. But it was the one piece of that doorway Alice had the power to change, and changing it mattered to her more than she could easily explain. Picture standing exactly where someone once stood over you, holding the same quiet authority once used on you, and realizing you get to decide, in this one small way, whether the cycle repeats or bends. By nightfall, the girl had stopped shaking, mostly. Alice caught herself checking on her twice more than necessary, and told herself it was simply good practice. What Alice couldn't have known, kneeling in that same doorway years earlier as the frightened one, is that the kindness she'd needed then would eventually be hers to give. She'd simply have to wait 17 years for her turn. So after 5 episodes, the honest answer to tonight's question is probably this: medieval teenagers were not insane. They were as reasonable, as impulsive, as tender, and as reckless as teenagers have always been. Dropped into a world with no space between being a child and being fully, permanently accountable for everything after. Edwin's plow line, Alice's shuttle, Wilkin's shoes, Marjorie's 9 words by the cider barrels, Osborne's stolen bell, Hal's split lip, Godwin's long walk home, Cecily's ring. None of it was madness. It was simply what growing up looked like when the world refused to wait. And now, if you've stayed this long, it's probably time to let all of that go for tonight. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they've been holding on. Let your breathing slow, one unhurried breath at a time, in through the nose, out slower than it came in. You don't have anything left to prove tonight to anyone. Somewhere far from here, a boy is falling asleep clutching a wooden sword, and a girl is falling asleep in an unfamiliar room that will, in time, simply become home. Their stories ended centuries ago. Yours is still going, quietly, tonight, in whatever bed you're lying in now. Just this moment, this breath, this soft, dark room. Let it get heavier. Let your thoughts get slower and further apart, like footsteps fading down a long, quiet road. There's nowhere else you need to be. If you enjoyed spending these 5 nights with medieval teenagers who were, in the end, just teenagers, we'd love it if you'd like this video and subscribe for more. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and which of these 5 stories stayed with you longest. Sleep well. We'll see you next time.